Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Allison Mon. She is going to be our speaker for today. She's a speaker, a writer, a consultant. She has done a lot of different things. She's not only speaking in national and state conferences, Roots Tech, the SLIG, the Salt Lake Institute for Genealogy. She's also a board member of the Utah Genealogical Association, and she's on the webinar and Crossroads committees. Crossroads is their newsletter. She writes articles for the Crossroads, and this is where she and I sort of cross over. Is she's an accredited genealogist. She has the credential. She's specialized in the Southwest region with ICAP Gen, along with a Bachelor of Science from Idaho State University. But for the ICAP Gen credential, she and I don't know if she even remembers me, but we were in the same ICAP Gen study group. And what I found was really interesting was she zoomed way ahead. She was way ahead of me and getting accredited and making sure that she wrapped that up. And I think it was probably just a month or two after the study group that she took the test. And I think she was the first one in our entire cohort who passed. So she is driven and committed to moving forward with genealogy, and you can see that with the way that she's been involved as well. Just being a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists, her involvement with UGA, and website, all sorts of things. She's really, really steaming ahead. So she's currently living in Salt Lake City, and we are very pleased to have her with us to present today on A Last Name for Marianne, Finding Maiden Names for Women. Welcome to Allison.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. Actually, when you said that, I do remember you being in the class, and you always were like, "No, no, I'm not ready yet. I think I'm going to." So, did you take the test for ICAP
I,
Gen?
I finally did. I took it last month.
Oh, good. Yes. Yeah. Well, I was wanting to get it done. I don't know if I was the first one to finish, but I did take it in February after we finished our class. Yeah, that was a crazy time. That's we did that over COVID, didn't we? Or well, we kind of it was sort of the tail end of COVID. We sort of got into that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do remember you being in that class. Oh, I never thought I was going to pass the test.
No, I still
Anyway,
don't either.
well, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be with you guys and talk about a last name for Marianne, who of course is my ancestor, and the just the hunt for looking for maiden names for women, which can sometimes be really tricky. Couple things to get us going. This is sort of just a picture of all the different records that you might see, that appear where you have most of the time the husband's last name and not their maiden name, right? So in memory of Myrtle J. Wedemeyer, Wedemeyer's Myrtle's married name, but not her maiden name. And then you see a little parent card, Mrs. W. Laposa from Mrs. Walter Laposa, but again, it doesn't have her maiden name either. And Mildred and Ted Voigt. So you even have Christmas cards and don't know what Mildred's maiden name is. And then even service pensions, Agnes Peters, Bruton Peters. Again, there's no mention of any of these women's maiden names. So you can see it's a hard thing sometimes because most women do change their last name. And so the question is, why is that? Why do women in the United States do that? And there isn't actually a specific law. It's more of sort of a historical English common law that, you were under sort of the protection, if you will, tradition of being your father, being your caretaker. And then when you got married, it was your husband. And so you would take his name. So that's sort of where that tradition comes from. So today we're going to talk about records that might have information about women's maiden names that can be helpful for us. And since, as Nathan said, I currently live in Utah, so a lot of our slides are from Utah, but I put a couple of Virginia pieces in here so we can talk a little bit about things that are the same and different in different states. So we're going to cover vital records and census records, newspapers, church records, probate, land. Whoops, my slides are skipping on me. Paper, Social Security, and We're just going to go through each of these and talk about how you can use those to help find maiden names for women. So, vital records, marriage, birth, divorce, death records, they're really useful because they were made at the time of the event, usually. And there's usually an eyewitness, a doctor, if it's a birth or a death. If it's a marriage, you often have clergy or family. So often these things can add to the strength of their validity. The downside with vital records is in some places they're not very new. For example, in Utah, you have to go 1920s when a lot of people had strong compliance, but there are records before them, but they're just really spotty. And so sometimes you'll find someone and sometimes you won't. Wow, my mouse is feeling extra sketchy today. So that kind of is the downside, but you might as well start with your first ancestors. If you have someone who was born before then, we'll get to some of those things too. So the real question, though, is how do you know when each area did have vital records? As most people realize, places like New England, they're sort of notorious for having vital records that started earlier. And so, how do we know when each of them started and how to get through all of that information so we can see if there really is a vital record? The Family Search Wiki is where I usually go first because it's an easy springboard. There are other places you can look for information like this. Later, after you've kind of culled out this and you're looking for other options. But each state has its own page. So here's Utah's page. You can see cut here, over here on the right-hand side. This is where you can find all the record types of information. So this will be where you click on the different records that you're wanting to look for. That's where we'll find our vital records. Here's Virginia's page. You can see over here the different record types going down. They do have a clickable map too, but it's a little further down because Utah's a nice sort of rectangle shape and Virginia is a little bit of a crazier shape, so then move it down on the page. So again, here's sort of the vital record page. And most of the states you'll see here you have a little chart, and it will talk about births, marriages, and deaths, when the earliest records were, when state registration happened, and then when compliance was. So this is the one for Utah. And then you can see here for Virginia, of course, it's much earlier. People didn't even get to, well, Americans did get to Utah until 1850, but see here we have the same thing. You got early birth records, the county and town, and then statewide registration was in the 1900s, and then you have your general compliance. Marriages are usually the ones that are started earlier. The county formation is really common in most states. So when researching, the goal is to find a maiden name with marriage records. That's a good place to start. If you can find a marriage record, then often it will have this. Many people know their ancestor's name, but not their ancestor's name, or maybe the last name of the husband. So sometimes you have enough information, even if you don't know your ancestor's maiden name, if you know her husband's maiden name, there may be enough information to search through databases and still find a marriage record. So when you're looking at marriage records, this is going to include everything. Certificates, licenses, bans, bonds, consent affidavits. So all of these different records that they created when a person was to get married, that should be what you're thinking of. So don't just look at like, oh, this is the marriage license and that's all. There should be other, there could be, not should, there could be other records with there. One thing to remember about marriage records is that because women often took their husband's name, if their husband died or they were divorced, when they got married the second time, the name on the marriage certificate will often not be their maiden name, but their previous married name. And most of us have had ancestors that were married several times. And it takes a little bit of digging to figure out sort of the order and what names appear. I have an ancestor who was married and divorced within 10 years, but then for the next 30 years of her life, she continued to use that last name of her husband and never went back to her her maiden name. So that's a really common thing that women saw. So you may see that happen often. So you can see here in this marriage license, you have Mildred Thurman, and she's marrying Theodore Voigt. And then on this page here, you have just some more information, but you can see that this is the marriage license, and shows her maiden name. So where do you locate marriage records? Um, this is going to be different, of course, depending on the state. So each state is going to have different information. So this is all going to be on the vital records page. It's going to have options of where to look for marriages in the state. Here's Utah's that we talked about. There are several different U.S. marriage records, and then just specifically Utah marriage records. Some of them are Utah County, but then they are also part of what's called the Western States Marriage Index. And so there's also all of the Western states have tried to combine their marriage records and put them in a database to look at as well. And then a couple pieces of information here where the territorial records were for Utah and then records before 1887. So one thing that's specific about Utah is that civil marriage registration was not required until 1887. So if you were married in Utah before then, you just had to have a church marriage, and that was sort of counted the same as being legally married. You didn't have to have a civil marriage. But after 1887, they changed that. So some of the marriage records you have to actually locate with a church if it's before 1887. I have some ancestors that were only married in their church, but they did not have any civil registration records. Other places like here in Virginia, where you guys are from, county marriage records were generally the earliest and the most complete records for Virginia. So it sort of is directing you to some of what happened in your state, specifically in this area, and then talking about records before 1853. And then beginning in 1660, right? A couple would receive approval to marry by posting a bond. So again, it's going to talk about the different records that were made. And all of these places are places where you'll be able to find a person's maiden name. The next place to look for records is, or to look for a woman's maiden name is on death records. Usually death records list maiden names, and sometimes they give the names of the parents, which will also give you a maiden name. Each state and time had their own certificates, right? So every state kind of has their own certificates. So some mention if people were married, but not necessarily their maiden names. Maybe it will only tell you that they were married, but might mention their parents' names. So a lot of these things kind of changed over time. Here's a few from Texas. You can see this one record just says Mrs. M.A. Smith. So as I said, earlier records, this is from 1912. And so you can see some of these, or sorry, 1903. Some of these earlier records don't have as much information, but if you wait a few more years, 1949, you can see it says a lot more information about Gertrude here, Smith, information about her father's name here, Edward Dickey, and Gertrude McAllister. So it is a little bit hard to know what you're going to get. The other thing to remember is that some places, one being Utah, that they had a state death register that started in 1847 and went through 1966. But for people looking for death records before, like death certificates were mandated, this is one place. Here's my ancestor at the very bottom here, Sarah E. White. And this says she was married. So although it doesn't say her maiden name, it does give you information about her being married. So I know this is not her married name, or likely not her married name, but more likely her, not her maiden name. So like I said, each of these pieces of information can kind of help you in your search and what you're looking for. Here we go. We're skipping right forward to locating death records. So where do we look for them? See, you can see in Utah at the very top, it says Utah Death Register. So if you want to know if the state you're looking in has a register, sometimes the Family Search Wiki will mention that. The register is actually on Ancestry, so you can notice that on the end. And then at the very bottom, it talks a little bit again about death records and what might be found on them, the different information. And even at the bottom, it tells you how you can write for a death certificate. The Utah State Archives are the ones who have all of the birth and death records in Utah, and they release them every hundred. Well, the birth records they release every 100 years because I've been collecting my grandmother's siblings' records from here. And so that's another place you could reach out to your state archives and find out what vital records they have and when they release them. Here's for the information for Virginia. And of course, because you guys were a state much earlier, you can see the death records from, from 1853 to 1896. The information is recorded in the death registers. And so you guys can see that you guys as well have a death register, and then the statewide registration began in 1912 for Virginia. Another place that you can look for death records is funeral cards. They're often located in your family collections. So a lot of times whatever uncle, aunt, grandmother, family member keeps some of these memorabilia, they have some of these. And this is my grandmother, Beth, on the end, and then her sisters, Carol and Vienna. And you can see each of them wrote their maiden name, Durfee, in the middle, and then their married name at the end. So sometimes some of these announcements will add things like a maiden name. It's possible as well that the funeral home, if they're still around, may have some of this information as well. It's usually best to send funeral homes like an email because they have a business and you calling them can kind of get in the way. But if you send them an email, sometimes that they'll look up some information. I have had some good interactions with funeral homes, sending them an email and asking them if they have any information for an ancestor. Cemetery records. Okay, so I do know headstones really don't often have a maiden name. However, remember, families can be buried in the same cemetery, and that may give you hints about family relationships. And I have a very good story about this. I have this headstone. So I found this headstone on Find a Grave with a note and the details that said that Mary Ellen Eckley was the daughter of George and Mariel Eckley. And I couldn't find any other Eckleys on Find a Grave. So I was like, well, are those her parents? I wasn't totally sure. And she was enumerated in Hastings, Michigan in 1870 with an M.A. Eckley. So it could have been Muriel, her mother. Like that's who was on there. Looked like it might be her mom. So I looked in a cemetery book for Berry County, Michigan, with the DAR put together, and I found what you see at the very bottom, which is that Muriel and George, this one not being her father, but her brother, both died and were buried near Ellen. So all three of their names are together. And actually, later I did finally find them on Find a Grave. Eckley can be spelled a lot of different ways, and I just hadn't put in enough information. But they're all buried in Riverside Cemetery. So I've had to do, a few other things to prove this, and I've also found the newspaper article about when Muriel and George died. But this sort of helps springboard me into finding the family and making sure that I had this information. So although the cemetery headstone itself didn't have her maiden name, it was written on Find a Grave, and I was able to use other sources to verify this information, this as well as the newspaper article about Muriel's death and her daughter being Ellen Voigt. So that's kind of what the cemetery option is about. It's not so much the headstone itself, but it may lead you to other options that can be really helpful. Okay, so where do you find cemetery records? This again is just the one from Utah, but Find a grave and billion graves are really common online sources, at least in the West. And again, they can give you a really good place to start. You can see there's also a lot of Utah burials, Utah cemeteries. I suspect in Virginia, it's the same, or whatever state your ancestors happen to be in. And Family Search does have a lot of these cemetery books that are digitized. So if you go to the catalog, you can find a lot of cemetery books that have been indexed. And another thing I have noticed is most of you guys know that the tombstones are getting old. And so even though we've been very good at, taking pictures of them more recently, some of them either just don't exist anymore or they're just really hard to read. But if you go back to the books that were transcribed 100 years ago in the 1920s or in the 1915, you have an option to see what people were able to record at that time, and it may give you some more information that you don't that you can't get now. So don't count those books out. Yeah. But like I said, there's also all these other options as well, and every state is going to have different state cemetery records. So here's another thing to remember too, is that most cemeteries do have a sexton. Now, whether the sexton records are easy to find or not, that can always be a toss-up. But this sexton record book from Brigham City is digitized and it is on Family Search. Some of them you might have to look for, like on at City Hall. But this one here, you can see, here's Sarah Ellen White that we talked about earlier. And this one has her father's name and her mother's name and the name of her husband. So even though the death records only had her married name, but none of this sexton record does have all of this information. And so sometimes what you just have on the headstone may be different than what's in the sexton records, and you may be able to get some more information. So again, like I said, finding the six sexton records, the as it says, it's not surprising the sexton office is usually the best place to look. But you may need to go to other genealogical societies or historical societies and the city hall. If they don't have it, the city hall is also a place where if they don't have it, they may be able to tell you where it's located or if it exists anymore. So that's another place to look if you're looking for some records, cemetery records that may give you some ideas about maiden names. Birth records. So I'm going to talk a little bit about birth records and delayed birth records. So finding birth records, of course, can be hard. I feel like this one, you just need ancestors who weren't born that long ago, unless you're in a state where they have really early birth records. The other thing is it's really hard to find a birth record if you don't know your ancestor's maiden name. For example, I have Beth Durfee, but what if I didn't know her maiden name was Durfee and I was looking up every Beth who had been born in Utah? That would take a long time. Even if I was able to narrow it down unless I knew her exact birthday. So sometimes I feel like by the time you know enough information to find a birth certificate, you almost know everything there is to know about your ancestor. But there are some other things that you may be able to figure out. Maybe your ancestor has a less common name, or maybe you have for some reason a birthday for her from later records, but you don't know her maiden name. And that could be another way to sort of push that information together. The second one you can see is a delayed birth certificate. So it's for my great grandmother Myrtle McCary, and she was born in Missouri, and they didn't have birth records in the 1800s, and when she was born. So this was her delayed birth record and was notarized in 1943. And it states that her maiden name was McCary, and then it also lists both names of her parents. Generally, a delayed birth certificate is given to anyone who didn't file a birth certificate in the first year that they were born. So you could have a delayed birth certificate even being born in 2026. One very common reason why people got delayed birth certificates around the 1940s is because with Social Security, you needed a birth certificate. And so there is a big chunk of time in the 1940s where a lot of people were getting delayed birth certificates. So that is one way that you can, find this. And if you look, this is from the State Board of Health of Missouri. That's where she was born, but she didn't live there. At the time she was living in California, right? It tells you here that it was signed in California by the Notary Public in the county of Los Angeles. So you still want to look at the state where they were born and not where they were living when they would have filed for the certificate. So again, locating birth records. This is still on the vital records page. This is Utah. It tells you the dates and the times when you can look at these records online. And then at the bottom, again, it talks about um, where you can get a record and the few county records that they have for births. And like I said, sometimes I ask the state archives if I feel like they haven't been posted on Family Search yet, but I think they should be released. Then I just write the state archives and they send it to me. So here's some information about Virginia, again, about early births and christenings, the kind of vital information that they had early. And then again, you guys also have information about delayed birth certificates. And they talk about them being created in the 1940s for adults, so they could be eligible for Social Security, which, like I said, was very, very common. Um, did I miss the slide? Oh, nope, sorry. Census records. Okay. Also, census records generally do not give women's maiden names either, but they do ask questions about marriages. So that can maybe help you if you're looking for a marriage record and you would like a little more information. That's one of the things that can help. Sometimes it will also tell you other people who lived in the household, and one of them may be a mother-in-law, which could also give you some information about a woman's maiden name. So in 1850, 1860, 70, 80, you were asked if you were married within the last year. So if you have ancestors who were born the year before the census was taken, it will mark that. Then in the 1900 and the 1910 census, they asked the number of years you were married. So you can sort of subtract. I found that mine were generally in the park range. That's what this one is here. They're married, it says 26 years, which is close. It was 30, but I figured it out all the same. But that's what this record here shows, married, and then the number of years you were married. In 1930, this is a fun one. It asks what age people were at their first marriage. So even if you were married multiple times, they still want to know how old you were when you were first married. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. But again, a way to kind of narrow down some information about marriage dates. So they give information about who lives in the household, like I was saying. So a mother-in-law that lives with a family or a brother-in-law may give some clues to the maiden name of the wife, because sometimes she had a brother living there too. The other thing that this family, the Jensen family, right at the very bottom, you can see Ella and Vera Humble. These were two of their nieces. Um, so again, just different last names and information that may help lead to the maiden name of your ancestor. So this is the link for Utah. And you can see this is actually 1850 is really the first census that they had. Because people weren't really there. It's really a territorial census. The first, it wasn't until 1900 when Utah was officially a state, but they were part of all of the other censuses because they were a territory by that point. Here's Virginia, and you can see the 1790 and 1800 aren't available, but there are census records from then. 1810 looks like it's a partial. Again, so you do have some information from census records. The next thing I want to talk about is newspapers. Newspapers often listed vital records, like marriage, birth, and deaths, but they were also a social column. So they wrote a lot of notes about people visiting other family members. Here's an example. This says Mrs. Valate Durfee of Beaver Dam is visiting her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jacob Jensen, this week. So if I didn't know Valate's maiden name, now I do because it just told me. The next one is that talks about the death of Mrs. Sarah Jensen, and it does not give us her maiden name. But look at what it does tell you. It tells you, well, it says that she died on Thursday. And so, using a calendar from 1919, I know that Thursday is the 25th of December, that she was at the home of her son, which was likely in Brigham City, since that's where the newspaper was. You can see, so you have information to look for a death certificate. It says she was married to the late Hans P. Jensen. So now you have marriage information to look at. It also says she was born on August 8th, 1929 in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. So even though Germany wasn't a country at the time, it does say Schleswig-Holstein, which would tell you where you could look for a birth information. And then it mentions her children and their married names. So again, you could look marriage records for them that sometimes mention. So you also have to remember children's marriage records can give information about both of their parents' names, and sometimes it will mention their mother's maiden name. So all of this information can be used to put together records that would show you what her maiden name was. So just because you look and it just doesn't say directly this is her maiden name, there may be enough information to lead you to all the records that will show you someone's maiden name. So newspapers, big newspaper databases, newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, Newspaper Archives. A free one is Chronicling America. Most states have something that is like their own state. Here's Utah's right here. Utah Digital Newspapers. This is just a free state-wide newspaper. It's run through a university, and a lot of places have that. I noticed when I was looking through this one in Virginia, although I have not looked at newspapers in Virginia, they have the Virginia Newspaper Project at the Library of Virginia, and Newspaper Chronicles. So there's several different places, Virginia online historical newspapers that may give you some information. That's not just in some of the bigger ones. I usually use the state one, as well as newspapers.com to see if there's anything I'm missing somewhere. Church records can be really great because they have baptisms, confirmations, marriages, burials. You can check for siblings if you know any of the siblings of your ancestors. And you can look at the children's names because, again, often it'll mention their parents' names, their father's name, and their mother with her maiden name. So that's another place. This certificate was specifically part of my family records. It's St. Luke's. It was an Episcopal church in Baggs, Wyoming. And this is my grandmother's certificate. And you can see at the very top, Mary Theodora Wedemeyer. And it also actually gives her birth date on here as well as her parents' names. This is a record. So here's the baptism register for the Catholic Church. It's for Illinois, and it gets the name of my great-great uncle, Frank Wolf. But notice it mentions both his father's name and his mother's name, including her maiden name. And so, again, even though I don't have her baptism, her children's baptism mentions her with her maiden name. So there are sometimes records of the children that will also give you information. As many of you guys know, European countries have like these very great church records. It seems like easy to figure out where people would be baptized. And the United States, wow, do we struggle here. So finding records online and looking for individual churches can be a little bit trickier in the United States. Here's Utah. church records. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the biggest church in Utah. So, as you can imagine, it has a lot of records, including census records that were taken in the church. But there are also other records, the Dutch Reformed, the Lutheran, Presbyterian, and Roman Catholic. The other thing that often you'll find is something like this. This is actually from your Virginia page. It will sometimes give you some historical background of the state where your ancestor lived and the makeup. The Church of England, now Protestant Episcopal, was the established church in Virginia from 1624 to 1786. So this gives you a good idea of if you're looking for ancestors, what would be the biggest ones, and then what are other religious groups that were in the area, so that you're looking for the church that would be most prominent in your area. There also is a book by Sonny Morton called How to Find Your Family in U.S. Church Records. So if you are a person who has a lot of church, like family members who belong to lots of different churches, or maybe just one church, but you don't really know how to search for it, her book could be one that might be really helpful to you. The other thing is probate records give information about family members, and each one tells different information. So it often mentions married children by their married names, which means you kind of have to, it's kind of a little bit tricky because you're trying to look for a woman with her married name in her father's will, and those can be harder to work out. But as most of you know with full text search, this is becoming more and more of a possibility. But here's just an example of a will that you can see. Like some of them, you can't find a single person's name. And then this one has a whole page written of all of the children, all of the children's children. So this has not only his children, but all of his grandchildren, how old they were, what their name is at the time that he died. This is what everyone's dream, what they hope every probate record looks like. So this is just one really great place to find women that were heirs of this person, John Lovelace. Again, looking for probate records, this is what we have in Utah that you can look for online. Here's just a little history I thought would be kind of interesting. Probate records in Virginia were kept at the county level. So it's telling you the best place to look for these records in that area. Land records, again, are another place that can or cannot have information. It's a little bit less common, but this is a really interesting quitclaim deed, and it's talking about all of the descendants of Althea Jensen. So my great-great-grandmother passed away. Then there's a list of all of her children, and again, it's listing them by their married name. But since they were all children of Althea Jensen, we know that all of these women, before they were married, had the maiden name Jensen. So it can link up families in that kind of way. And we all are very appreciative when this happens, although I don't have a ton of these. Again, land records, just depending on what state you're in, there were a lot of US land patents and BLM land tracts that were given because of, and homesteading is a big thing in the West. So we have a lot of that here in Utah. In Virginia, you can see there's the colonial and state land grants, and it gives a lot of information about how that was put together. So to find land records and probate records, you can use the full text search, and it's now just on the search engine of Family Search. If you go straight to where it says search at the top, it'll say full text search, and you can put in your ancestor's name, and it may pull up a few records that you haven't been able to find before and help out with the search for an ancestor's maiden name. Personal papers. This is kind of a mixed bag. This could be anything: a journal, a life sketch, autobiography, letters, pedigree charts. Here's a part of a letter that my great-great-grandmother wrote to my mom, and she just listed all the different people in her family and when they married and where they married, a lot of them. Sometimes you have stuff like that within your family group, and sometimes you don't. But it could include a bride's name, a groom's date, a date, sometimes places. And she often did write down the maiden names of the women. Here's a picture from a family scrapbook. And again, it's of my ancestors, my great ancestor Marianne Harrell McCary. And this is with her two of her sisters and a brother. And notice it says all of their married names. And then at the bottom it says they were all Harrell before they were married. So again, you'd never think to just look through your photo album, but it's amazing sometimes what you can find even in photographs that give information about people's married names, maiden names. So where do you find these personal papers? Unfortunately, we don't have an online link, so that sometimes makes it a little trickier, but I just ask people, I bug people about it. My sister was visiting an uncle and she brought back a little tote of some genealogy papers for me to scan. And I get pictures from people, take pictures with my phone sometimes if I'm in a pinch and just photograph. That's how I photocopy all the records. And I just do what I can. Ask around, ask friends, message people on Family Search and Ancestry. I've sent out hundreds of messages. And I don't get a lot always back, honestly, but every person I've ever reached out to that has reached back out to me, almost all of them have just the smallest bit of information that I didn't have before. And they always help link up just a few pieces of new information. It's always been worth it. Social Security. So this is really recent, but it still is very good if you're looking for information for people who have been around about 100 years. So this is my collateral ancestor. She married my, I was looking for my uncle La Posa, and I was trying to figure out who his wife was and what happened after they divorced. So this is Geraldine Steiniger, and you can see La Posa is one of the maiden or one of the married names that she had. But actually, if you look, Steiniger was her maiden name. Williams was the first person she married, Laposa the second, and Griffin was the third. So it took a little bit of time, but you can see here it lists her father and her mother. And then it talks about when she did these different name changes. And so if you do have an ancestor that maybe had a couple different name changes, Social Security will track some of that and it can help sort of sort that out. If you're looking for it, there's the Social Security Death Index and the Social Security Application and Claim Index. So this is from the claim application and claim index. That's the one that will have the mother and father on it. The death index doesn't usually have the mother and father listed. So now that we've talked a little bit about this, I just want to talk about a practical case and how to observe what happens when you're looking for somebody's maiden name. So I have an ancestor named Marianne Wolf, and she lived in Illinois. She actually originally came from someplace in the German area. I maybe Baden, but it's a little tricky. But we're just going to go through all of the records that I talked about and look at the last name or her maiden name. So here we have her marriage certificate. I actually do have a marriage certificate for her civilly, 1857. You can see End Lesoffer is written as her maiden name. But then she had a church marriage a few years later in 1959, written in Latin, and it says her name was Maria Anna Inlekoffer. You can see this that the last or her maiden name is changing a little. Her death certificate says her father's name was Lekoffer and her mother's name was unknown. So it doesn't have her maiden name written on there and a little bit of information about a father and mother's name. Cemetery records. Here's a picture of her headstone, and as I've said, it does not have a married. It does not have her maiden name, and she was buried in the cemetery with some of her children, but no relatives that I know of are buried in this cemetery. As I said, she immigrated to the United States. She sort of appears out of nowhere, and so I don't know that any of her family came to the United States with her. I did actually find an obituary of her, and um, it actually does say that Mary Intercrossen was born 86 years ago in Germany, and she came to the state at the age of 18 years old and married Frank Wolf. And this is very helpful because it sort of corroborates some of the things that I have known about her. A census record. So in the 1900, it said that they'd been married for 40 years, that they were both born in Germany, and now they're living in Christian County, Illinois. And this works out pretty well because I did find their marriage certificate, as you saw. Church baptisms. So I don't have her baptism record because I don't know exactly where she was from in Germany well enough to pinpoint a parish. But here's all of her children. And then her marriage is actually the very first one. And then it has her children that are baptized. And then it talks about this first line is just the different spellings of her last name. You can see it's spelled Inlekoffer, then it's spelled Intlekoffer, and then it's spelled Inglekoffer and Entlekoffer. So you can kind of see. And the reason that this has been really helpful for me is that she would have been alive at the time that all of these children were baptized. So she would have been saying her name to a person and they would have been writing it down as they were hearing it and deciphering it. And then, of course, I just put the years. This is just in chronological order so I could get a bit of a feel. Um, Probate. Her husband, Frank Wolf, did write a will in 1908 and does mention his wife, Marianne. He has a daughter, Mary, and a son, John. They have other children, but they were married at this time. So they aren't mentioned in the will. So unfortunately, I have nothing for Marianne or anything about a family member yet to help me with this information. Personal papers, if you can believe, I have a letter from Edith Trost. She was a daughter of Katie Wolf, who was Marianne's daughter. And she is just telling a little story about what she knows about Marianne and Frank's story. And she just says that her name was Interkoffen and that they were both born in Germany. Her grandparents were both born in Germany. So again, it's sort of some of the same. Negative findings, birth record. Again, because the only thing I've ever been able to find is that she was from Baden, and that was like a big state at the bottom area where Germany is now. There's just been no way to even figure out where to look. Will records, again, I didn't really find anything specific for her. Her husband did have a land record, but they didn't seem to have a lot of money and they didn't seem to have a lot of land deeds in their name. And then, of course, she was born too late to have Social Security. So for Marianne specifically, with her surname, I was making a list. So this is the list of all of the records I could find that mentions Marianne and her maiden name. Because for some people, we just can't find a maiden name, and other people, we can find a maiden name, but if you look at the list, it's almost never spelt the same way. And so I'm trying to get a better idea of how her name would have been spelled so that I can find at some point maybe a birth record, because that's the other tricky part is I don't want to go over there and start looking in Germany for a birth record until I have a last name, something that I can look at. So that's why I made this chart to kind of help me sort out records that were made when she was alive, then records made with more like towards the end of her life. But they're like her children's marriage certificates and her children's death certificates and what people put down. For a few of you who have a similar problem to me, where it's a little bit less about finding a maiden name and maybe trying to pin it down a little, just some things to remember about surnames that standardized spelling is very new. So the fact that I have that many spellings is really not that uncommon. Um, People just wrote down what they heard, and the idea of standardized, not even just your first name, but just even words didn't really come around until the 1900s. So most of the people just wrote down what they heard. And so from Marianne, she was likely from Baden, so she has this German accent, and now she's in Illinois, and people are listening and writing down. You can see that it's going to be tricky. And then a lot of the church records, of course, are in Latin, and so there's a lot of reasons for spellings to be different. So I know a couple people who I've talked with and they've been like, well, no, that's not my ancestor. That's not how their last name was spelled. And I'm like, well, it might have been. And they're like, no, I don't think it ever changed. I was like, okay, I didn't want to be super pushy, but the reality is it probably it was their ancestor because a lot of these people didn't know how to spell their own name. They didn't always know how to read and write very well. And so you just have to keep your mind open for lots of spellings and try to keep your list. Most of us that have people in our family that have last names like this, we have a list of all the spellings we come across. Here's just a few books and videos for people if you're just kind of trying to get an idea about last names and surnames. There's a couple different things. And the one name studies, this is very interesting to me because of my ancestor Marianne. That idea of having a one name study and just thinking about what last name it might be and all the variations and spellings from it. That is it for me tonight. They're talking about last names and ways to find maiden names for people and my little case study of all the different maiden names I was able to find and look up. So I don't know if people have any questions or if you guys are good. You've got it all down now.
Let's give her a round of applause. Thanks so much, Allison. Really appreciate that. Um, Such an important topic because it's half of our ancestry essentially. The women in our lives, the women ancestors, female ancestors, so important. And what a broad swath that you carved out. I mean, lots and lots of talk of very diverse set of records. I really appreciate that. Um, yeah, we do have time for Q&A. What questions do you have for Allison? You can put it in the chat. You can just come off mute. What would you like to ask? And I can get us started. I had a question for you. You've mentioned so many different places that you found maiden names and so many different examples, document records that you've come up with. I was curious, where is the sort of the most unexpected place where you have identified a maiden name in all of those records that you've been through? What was the most
Um,
unique?
the one that was sort of just given to me were the church records in Illinois because it came up as a hint on Ancestry, and I didn't know that Ancestry had Catholic Church baptism records online. I don't know that they have all of them, but I didn't know that they even had any. And it was just one of the siblings and so once I had that though, then I went through and kept searching within that database to see, and I could find all but two of the children I was able to find their baptism record. And so that kind of it also was like I just had the hint for the one son. And then of course, because I was able to find five more of the children, it really gave me a lot of spellings of her name. And then that's when I also realized that I might be able to find a church marriage record. And the same thing, like I was able to search in that same database and find their marriage record. And so there's just always times where keeping and tinkering around with families, sometimes things will just come up that you didn't ever see or you didn't know about. So that was a really good one. I guess the other one was the letter. I didn't know my mom had written to her grandmother, and she had that list of marriage. And she was like, "Oh yeah, I wrote my grandmother once, and you're sort of asking about family stuff." And she died. My mom's grandmother died before I was born, and so had she not written the letter, I would have none of those, none of that list at all. And it just the same thing. It makes it, as you guys know, it makes it so much easier if you kind of have like a name and a date and you're searching. It's like, wow, this is so much faster than just kind of digging through everything. And so, and then having the bride and groom's name there too. I was like, wow, this is so like I said, I didn't know my mom had that. And so I was like, okay, I need to start. Mom, hang on, what do you have? Let's open up your little box. And so I started going through a lot of the records that she compiled. I'm like, I'm not redoing your research. You already did it.
Genealogical gold. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's see. Other questions that folks have. And while you're thinking about that, I'm putting a link in there for feedback. We do really value your feedback on our programs, and we definitely take that into consideration when we're coming up with our new speakers and topics as well. So please do click on that link and provide some feedback. Love to hear from you. Other questions?
I don't have a question, but just great overview cover. I think part of the reason why I don't have any questions is because you covered everything. Like everything
Thank
else
you.
is just really hyper
Thank you.
specific, right? So, and I
Yeah.
asked earlier about like the challenge of
Yeah.
colonial times, but I have a feeling
Yeah.
it's going to be by locality.
Yes. No, I mean, yeah, it's hard to talk about all women, like you said, all the time, um, but yeah, I'd like to try to just you remind people to kind of go back through their stuff and make sure you didn't miss anything. I know how I get when I research one person, I'm really zoned in, but then time goes past and I kind of forget to go back and kind of recircle back new newspapers that have been digitized, new records that have been put online, and or a new person who's on Ancestry now that has something of your families that you didn't meet up before, but now's the time to meet up. So
It's a good reminder. There's so many things changing in genealogical research these days.
I am always like, I just looked at newspapers.com like 6 months ago. And then, I mean, it's not always a lot, but there's always, I'll be like, where did these two newspapers come from? And I'm like, did I search my last name right? Or anyway, my last names are either something strange like Intelkoffer or it's Smith, my dad's name. And so I'm like, great. I have something I can't spell and then something that everyone's last name is exactly the same. So I'm like, I just want like a medium one where it's not too hard to spell, but anyway.
All the
I also
challenges.
do I also do have an ancestor with a maiden name Monday, but you can't search it all because then every time the day of the week comes up, it also pulls that up and their last. So I'm like, oh man, this is killing me.
Question. I know a lot of other cultures, French, German, etc., that women keep their maiden names even
Mhm.
when they're married. But
Yeah.
Canada, do you know, since it's sort of half English, half French, did the English women there by any chance keep their maiden names, or did they do what they did back in Britain and go with the married?
Yeah. I don't know because I don't have any ancestors in Canada.
Okay.
But I do suspect, since it was a very common thing in England, that they probably did the same. But
Okay.
like to your point, yes, there are a lot of places where women kept their maiden names.
Yeah.
Spanish speaking countries in Spain and South America, they usually have combined names. And
Yeah.
so women keep their maiden name and then their children get their mom and their dad's last name. So there's a lot of different in each country it does sort of switch around. But I don't go to the Canada page on Family Search Wiki and see what it says under marriages
Okay. Thank you.
and see if it says and see if it will tell you if they kept their maiden name or if they changed it when they got married.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Last call for questions. All right. Well, thank you so much, Allison. Really, really
Thanks for
appreciate
having me.
you coming. Yeah, this is wonderful. And yeah, so you're welcome any time in the future too. We'll keep that in mind. But yeah, so for those who are still on the line, please do provide feedback on the talk. The link is in the chat, and also don't forget we have our upcoming event on Saturday in person. We're going to be learning some incredible things together as we move on to our next topic, and that's photos, specifically identifying our family members in old photos and getting some clues out of them. So hope you can make that. And thank you so much for joining us today with Allison's presentation, all of you. And we'll just, once again, round of applause for Allison. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks. And
Thank
good
you.
luck, Nathan, with your test. I hope you get your scores back soon. It's exciting.
Yeah, me too. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I almost done.
Yeah, that's right. All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye.